We are so glad to have everyone watching us. I'm Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. Welcome to our virtual event with Professor Robert Reich. This is an event that we had been really looking forward to for a long time. Of course, we were planning to do this as an in-person human-to-human interaction event, but we are now, as he noted earlier, becoming Zoombies. That's the Zoom version of zombie. So we're going to embrace that, just go with it. I want to tell you about a couple of things coming up. We just on Monday started a new series where we will be doing, this one is a slight change, but from now on we'll be doing virtual events on Monday evenings and Thursday evenings, basically at least till June, and then we'll kind of see where we are beyond that. But we have a ton of great stuff coming up. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, we are going to be chatting with Connor Knighton from CBS Sunday Morning, who has written a new book about the national parks. He visited every national park, and we'll be talking to him about that on tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. So if you haven't registered for that, it's free and open to the public. Please do that. And then we have talks coming up about the Electoral College with the writer from the New York Times. We have stuff coming up about walking, the benefits of walking. We certainly are doing a lot of that right now. We're doing all kinds of stuff. So I hope you guys will tune in and do that. A couple of other things. A lot of you already bought Professor Reich's book because this was a ticketed event. If you have not gotten the book yet, though, please visit magiccitybooks.com and you can get that book from us directly after the talk. Certainly pay attention, and you don't need to do it while we're doing this, but go right after that. We can get you all set up. There also will be a link posted probably in the comments where you can click on that and buy the book directly there as well. Our guest moderator for tonight is Brian Hosmer, who's a great friend of Magic City Books and Booksmart Tulsa and has been for a long time. Brian is an associate professor of Western history at the University of Tulsa, and he's a member of the Board of Education here in Tulsa too, and is a really engaged member of our community in many different facets. So he was at the top of our list when we were thinking about who we needed a smart guy to talk to Professor Reich. And I know many people smarter than Brian Hosmer here in Tulsa. So he's going to be our guest moderator this evening. But our very special guest, of course, is Professor Robert Reich. You probably know his history as the former Secretary of Labor during the Clinton administration. You've seen him on every talk show in the world, and he's always the most compelling voice on whatever panel he's on or whatever interview he's doing, and really speaks to certainly that kind of Oklahoma strain of like that Woody Guthrie populism. You know, a lot of people didn't ever realize when Elizabeth Warren was running for president that she was from Oklahoma. And there's a connection between that kind of Woody Guthrie populism and what Elizabeth Warren represents. And, you know, the fact that Eugene Debs, you know, came in second and, you know, behind FDR at one point, and all these kind of things that were happening in Oklahoma during the Depression and the Dust Bowl and all these kind of things, and where they leave us now. There's a reason why Oklahoma was one of only, 3 states that Bernie Sanders won in 2016. There's something there that's about Oklahoma, even though we are a very red state and we're very conservative in many ways. There's something underneath that has always kind of been that kind of populist, democratic, lowercase d democratic strain that is always something that's right there under the surface. And at moments it pops up. When we had our teacher strikes a couple of years ago, some of the things that were happening then were really kind of reminiscent of those labor movements and how people kind of came together. And Oklahoma became a really central point in some of those places. So, and of course, where we are now, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Money is being handed out like, you know, every day, billions and trillions of dollars. There's a new vote happening, I think, from the House tomorrow on the next round of relief going out. Who's keeping an eye on that money? Where is it going? What's happening to it? These are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and I can't think of a better person to do that than Professor Robert Reich. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian and Professor Reich to talk about this for a while. Post your questions. We'll incorporate them if we can. Have a great time, and take it away, gentlemen.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the introduction, and I also I like the context you're offering, and I do think that we're in a red state with different kinds of red in our history, right? I mean, a number of years ago, I had the honor of hosting a symposium that was honoring the centennial of Woody Guthrie's birth. And we entitled the symposium A Different Shade of Red, with that whole kind of thing in mind. And it was really a great way to sort of generate interest and also speak to something that's really important about Oklahoma. I'm also really honored to be moderating and asking questions tonight. Robert Reich is somebody I have admired for quite some time and watched him from the time in the Clinton administration and read his works and really admire the way that he speaks candidly and forcefully, but also in a very approachable way about these deep issues that are affecting our economy and our politics, really our political economy, I guess is one way we used to say it. So it's really my honor and to be here and welcome all of the folks who are meeting with us, joining us virtually. So what I'm going to do, we've got a few minutes here to ask some questions, and I'm going to jump right in. And I've got a few questions, but of course, if you have some questions for me, please send them our way, and I'll try to incorporate them, as Jeff said. So where I want to begin is with this and thinking about our moment where we are right now. And there's no shortage of books, it seems to me, on rising inequality and structural deficiencies, democracy disfigured by growing disparities of wealth, deep dissatisfactions that manifest themselves in rage and scapegoating and sometimes in apathy. Right now, my reading table includes The Velvet Rope Economy. I've been reading George Packer's essays in The Atlantic, thinking about Thomas Piketty and Thomas Frank and Hillbilly Elegy and Joseph Stiglitz, not to mention a number of essays regularly published in The Guardian, including many by Robert Reich. So what I want to begin with is sort of ask you to take stock of this moment. So what's going on right now? We have all of these works of which you've been a primary contributor. Help us maybe think about where we are and why we're seeing this efflorescence, it seems to me, in this kind of writing.
Let me get to your question, Brian. But first of all, before I do, I just want to thank Jeff Martin and Magic City Books for arranging this. I wish I could be with you in person. I was really, as I told Jeff a few moments ago, I was really looking forward to joining you in Tulsa. Thank you for those of you who did buy my book, The System, which we'll talk about. And I'm sorry that, again, I wanted to sign your books. You know, it's a thrill for an author to actually be there with people. That's what writing, particularly writing, the kind of writing I do, is all about: meeting people and signing books and as politicians say, touching the flesh. So I was looking forward to it, but what can we do? We can't do anything. And Brian Hosmer, thank you for your contributions, not only today, but more importantly, far more importantly, to Tulsa, to education, to all of the things that you represent and all the things you're doing. I think you're one of those great heroes that keep places going. So back to your question. After having said all that, let me talk about this moment, and that's what your question about. What is the moment? And the moment is obviously a pandemic. I wrote The System, obviously before the pandemic, but what the pandemic that we're now tragically suffering, some of us much more than others, the pandemic reveals a lot of things about our society that I talked about in The System. Sadly, I didn't foresee, obviously nobody foresaw the pandemic, but the things that stand out in sharp, stark relief are, number one, the class structure. I mean, we do have at least 4 different experiences that people are now enduring. Some people, most of them relatively poor, many of them people of color, many of them women, are on the front lines. They are so-called essential workers. They're in hospitals, they're in warehouses, they are doing some of the hardest and most risky work, and they're not being protected. I mean, my sister-in-law is a nurse in Massachusetts. She I was talking to her recently. She still doesn't have any protective gear, protective masks. They still haven't given her anything. And she and her fellow nurses are right there with people who have this dread disease. How can we treat our frontline workers like that? We wouldn't have a war and put our troops out into the field without adequate protection. And so, not only should we protect these essential workers, but they should get hazard pay, in my view. They should be getting, paid sick leave. It's one thing for us all to celebrate them and treat them as heroes, but we have to, if we're really going to treat them as heroes, we really have to pay them and honor them with a quality of life that really does reflect what they're doing. So they're one group, these essential workers. Another group are people who are unemployed. They just don't have a job. They've lost their jobs. Something in the order of 25 million at least. I mean, my estimate right now is about 30 million Americans who are unemployed, don't have a source of income right now. 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, which means a huge number of these people don't have any capacity to pay the rent or the mortgage or to buy food. And what are they doing? They're borrowing. They're maybe dipping in a little bit into savings, but most of them don't have any savings. So these are our fellow Americans, and this is an emergency. In the Great Depression, 25% of America was unemployed. Right now, we could see those levels of unemployment. At the rate we're going, I wouldn't be surprised if we got there by the mid or late May. And they are doing it not because we have an economic depression or recession. They're doing it because we have a health crisis, a health emergency. And they are staying home. They are unemployed because of a health emergency. And I think the least we can do is make sure that they have at least enough money to live on so that they can survive and their families can survive. So that's another category of people who are also being, I think, mistreated. A third group who are being mistreated are people who are, they're marginal people in our society. They're homeless people. Where are homeless people? Well, many of them are crowded into homeless shelters. Well, what happens when they're crowded into homeless shelters? Or what happens to another related group of people who are at our nation's borders or want to claim refugee status, who are being detained, or who have been undocumented workers who are being detained in prisons at our borders? They are also at grave risk, and many of them are disproportionately getting this virus. We have people who are on, Native Americans. Those Native American tribes are in terribly bad shape. Some of them, the Navajo Nation, has now more COVID-13 cases than 13 states put together, more deaths than 11 states put together. And then you also have very poor people in our nation's urban areas who are crowded together because they are poor. They can't afford to live separately. They are extended families in the same room or the same two rooms, like we had in the late 1890s, the last time we had a Gilded Age, where you had poverty that forced people to live in impossible situations. A lot of these people don't have health care. They've not been able to afford health care. They can't see a doctor. They have pre-existing conditions because of their poverty, because they have asthma or heart disease, or they have diabetes, and these pre-existing conditions have made them even more susceptible. So these three groups of people, the essential workers, the unemployed, and the marginal crowded people crowded together, they are all bearing a disproportionate brunt of the cases and the deaths, Brian. And we all should be terribly worried about them. Mm-hmm. Privileged few, and it really is a minority in America, are all of us. We are professional workers, we're management workers, we're technical workers. We are continuing to pull in a paycheck because we can work remotely. It's a privilege to be able to do this. It's inconvenient, yes. I have a lot to complain about if I don't think about the plight of most other people, but that inconvenience is nothing compared to what others are enduring. So the short of it is our class structure, the inequalities, the vast inequalities that have become much, much worse over the last 40 years are demonstrating themselves in very, very stark and vivid ways in this pandemic. My other point, and I'll be brief because I know you've got a lot of questions, is that with that inequality comes inequality of political power. Who is it who is getting paid off? Not average people. Average people are still waiting for their unemployment checks. They were supposed to get their unemployment. Most unemployment offices are totally overwhelmed. People can't even get through to them. The unemployment system was not designed for this. We don't really have an unemployment system to help people through these kinds of sharp downturns. We saw this in the Great Recession, but it's much, much worse now. And those small business payroll protection, well, it went to a relative handful of small businesses that are not really small businesses. It turns out many of them are very large businesses. Among the people who applied for those, and we don't know exactly who got them yet because the whole system is so enshrouded in mystery, but among the businesses that applied for those so-called small business loans that would be forgiven were hedge funds, Wall Street. Now, meanwhile, who got bailed out? Well, the biggest companies in America are getting bailed out. Companies that don't need to be bailed out. I mean, the airlines,
Right.
break. I mean, the airlines have capital, they have collateral, they have airplanes. Those airplanes didn't suddenly become worth nothing. They can borrow against those airplanes. They've been borrowing for years. In fact, they've been borrowing so much over the last few years. All these big corporations that are getting bailed out, they've been borrowing so much over the past few years. They've been borrowing it to buy back their shares of stock to show kind of a sugar high in the stock market. So their top executives and their major investors could cash in. But actually, it wasn't real. It was all founded upon a gigantic rising sea of debt. And they're now being bailed out by both the Treasury and the Fed, while average people are not being bailed out. It's just what we saw in 2008 with the financial explosion. You know, the big banks got bailed out, but homeowners lost their homes. Everybody else lost their jobs or their savings. Exactly the same, but on a much larger scale. And frankly, you know, good old populist Oklahoma, a lot of you people out there, I know, regardless of whether you call yourselves Republicans or conservatives or liberals or progressives, doesn't matter. You know that average people are being shafted once again, and it's time it stopped.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate the way that you brought that around the bend, because not only identifying the people who are getting shafted, but also the other part of it, right? And who's benefiting from the system. And I also appreciate you bringing up the question of the airlines, which was one example of many, but one that made me crazy too, right? And thinking, and not only that, thinking that we bailed them out again. Right. So this isn't the first time. We bailed them out after 9/11. We bailed them out in 2009. And yet it strikes me that I'm not even sure I understand how they're a private company if they can't survive without the public dole. That's a whole other conversation, sort of bends the mind. But what I want to do is move to something a little bit more specific. That brings us to a question. And this book deals, you know, at great length with this question of oligarchy. And you were just touching upon it. You're identifying it as a factor, but you spend a fair amount of time, I think, very usefully talking about how this happened, right? Sort of what are the features of that oligarchy? How do we understand its history? How did it come to be, right? How does it perpetuate itself? So we have this oligarchy, but it didn't just come about because of natural forces, because it's just the natural way the world has to be, right? It came about in some measure through action, and we could even say public policy.
And I saw it close up, Brian. I mean, my first job in the federal government was as an intern to Senator Robert Kennedy in the late 1960s. And then my second job was under the Ford administration. Actually, my first permanent job in government, people don't know this, was in a Republican administration. And then I was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Labor. And all along the way, what happened was the average wage for the typical worker in America from the late 70s all the way through today that median wage has gone absolutely nowhere if you adjust for inflation in terms of real purchasing power. Most people are doing no better today than they did in the late 1970s. But the economy is almost twice as large. So where did all the money go? Well, guess what? It went upward. It went to the top. And that's where you get these gigantic fortunes that are similar to the fortunes we saw in the 1880s, 1890s, in the Gilded Age. But now with that money goes political power. Now that's the key. That's what I talk about in this book, because money, wealth, and political power are inextricably related. The term oligarchy is an old ancient Greek term meaning a society in which a relatively few people have the wealth and the power to control society. And I use the term advisedly. I mean, we are in an oligarchy. Most people don't have much, if any, political power. I've seen it. You know, when I was Robert Kennedy's intern, it was different in 1967. But we've seen over the last 50 years, more than 50 years, an increase in the wealth and power at the top. By the time I got to be Secretary of Labor for Bill Clinton, frankly, it doesn't matter whether it's Democratic or Republican administrations, I was amazed and appalled at the amount of money big corporations and the wealthy were pouring into politics to change the rules of the game to help them. And this brings us to the centerpiece in the book, which is that the market, the so-called free market, is not a free market. That is a mythology. The free market is based on rules. You can't have a market without rules. Those rules are influenced more and more by people with power and wealth. So, for example, bankruptcy, which is on a lot of people's minds right now. Well, if you are a former student who has a lot of student debt, you can't declare bankruptcy. You can't reorganize your debt. You used to be able to. But guess what? The big banks, the big creditors, they changed the bankruptcy law. Similarly with homeowners, you know, if you couldn't pay your mortgage, well, you used to be able to use bankruptcy to reorganize your mortgage payments so you could stay in your house. Guess what? Big banks changed that, so you no longer can do that. But if you are a big business, if you are an airline right now, in fact, the airlines have used bankruptcy at least 4 times over the last 25 years. And they have just gone in and out of bankruptcy, which gets back to my point. Can't they do it again? Obviously, they turns out they'd rather not, but they could. The point is that all of these laws, whether you're talking about even property, I mean, even property, something as basic as property, well, that's changed too. Intellectual property, trademarks, patents, copyrights, intellectual property, those property rights, intellectual property rights, we call them, they used to be much shorter in duration than they are now. But you've got big pharmaceutical companies, big drug companies, and others that have continued to extend their patents, extend their copyrights. So we are average people are spending through the nose for pharmaceuticals because they have changed the laws, they've changed the rules. And I could go through all the laws, all of the ways in court decisions, in legislative decisions, at the federal level, at the state level, over and over again. We see money, big money, and wealth and power, big corporations, the wealthiest people in this country, basically getting wealthier and more powerful because they continuously change the rules of the game. And I'll tell you something, Brian, having seen it up close, as I have, you know, I can write about it, I can cite studies, I can, you know, that's easy to do. But what I also want people to understand is that it's real. Yeah. And it affects people. Because if you're on the losing end of the stick, and most Americans are, you are going to have to be singing Woody Guthrie songs in order. I mean, you know, you talk about Woody Guthrie and Elizabeth Warren and Eugene Debs and everybody else. Well, Oklahomans know this stuff. You know it in your guts, in your blood. This misalignment of power in this country, this diminution of democracy, is really dangerous. As the great jurist Louis Brandeis once said, And he was saying it about the former Gilded Age. We're now in a second Gilded Age. Louis Brandeis once said, we have a choice. We can have huge amounts of wealth in the hands of a relatively few people, or we can have a democracy. But we can't have both.
Yeah, I think that's a great set of points, and I really appreciate the way that you're challenging us to understand the development and the perpetuation of oligarchy as a series of actions that are taken, right? That are the consequence of this nexus of wealth and political power, and that they're not simply the natural working out of the economy. I mean, I'm always struck by this notion of the economy, right? And like to ask my students, what is this thing that you call the economy? What is it? What's it? What's it for? Do we work for the economy? No, the economy is supposed to work for us, right? And that is sort of a way to look at this. And so this leads me to a separate. Go ahead.
Excuse me, Brian. I just for this point. The economy is based on human decisions.
Right.
And I entitled the book The System is because unless we understand it as a system, there's no way we can actually regain control over it. And the longer we think of ourselves as on the left or the right, and we get into battles over Republican versus Democrat, we are not seeing where the real power lies. The oligarchy wants us to go to battle. They want us to constantly be divided by Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, native-born or immigrant or black or white. This enables the oligarchy to stay in power because as long as we fight among ourselves and we don't look up and see where the power and wealth really are, then the oligarchy is safe. Divide and conquer is one of the oldest strategies the oligarchies in history have used.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. And in your book, you speak about the language that we use and the kind of conceptual framework that we've become used to that also leads us to argue about these wrong things, right? Or these distractions, left, right, capitalism, socialism, growth and not growth, and all of these various things. And that this is precisely, one of the mechanisms that perpetuates the oligarchy, because in some sense we're not able to see it. And I'm more sort of want to probe that a little bit more and think about questions that are really deeply, or concepts that are fairly deeply rooted in American culture. Maybe something as simple or deceptively simple as American exceptionalism, and how notions of American exceptionalism may make it more difficult for us to see, right, the structural power that we're not able to access, or miss, sort of in some sense, the extremes of wealth and deprivation that we see. So I'm thinking about the conceptual framework that we use to describe ourselves as a society.
I think that we are certainly exceptional in a whole variety of positive ways and negative ways. I mean, one of the negative ways we're exceptional is that we have the skimpiest, most meager social safety nets of any modern society, any modern economy. Most other economies, they have a single-payer healthcare system that is cheaper than ours, and it goes to everybody. They have paid medical and family leave, paid sick leave. They have paid vacations. The typical paid vacation time in Europe is 5 weeks. The European worker is not less productive than the American worker. The European economies actually are doing, until recently, we all are doing badly, but we're doing pretty well. The exceptionalism mythology actually forces us not to look elsewhere, even to look north. I mean, even Canada, we just assume that we do it right and we don't have anything to learn from anybody else. But I think that that's changing, Brian. And I think it's changing in ways that are very subtle but very important. Let's see, 2000, must have been the fall of 2015. I was doing research for this book, for the system, early research. And I was in Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina and Virginia and Missouri. I didn't come to Kentucky, unfortunately, but I was undertaking kind of free-floating focus groups, asking people about their attitudes, attitudes about America, attitudes about their jobs, attitudes about the future. And what I found surprised me. Uh, People who years earlier, when I was Secretary of Labor and I would meet them, they would say to me, "We're working harder than ever, but we understand it'll turn around. We'll get more opportunities. Our children will do better than we are." By 2015, most people I was talking to in 2015, most people said, "No, the game is rigged. No matter how hard I work, I'm not going to get ahead." And then I began asking people, well, a presidential election is coming up. Who are you interested in? And all over the country, in the states that I talked to people in, which were swing states, people told me, now this was the fall of 2015, people told me, well, we're interested in two people, two candidates. One is Bernie Sanders, the other is Donald Trump. And when people first said that to me, I was incredulous, because I said, how can you have in the same sentence Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump? They're light years apart. But people across America that I talked with, working class people, average working people, poor people, what they said to me is, no, Bernie Sanders will shake things up. Donald Trump will shake things up. Bernie Sanders understands it's a rigged game. It's a rigged system. He'll unrig it. Donald Trump understands it's rigged. He'll unrig it. In other words, in the public's mind, both of these men were people who they could trust to get rid of the corruption. Mm-hmm. Now, Donald Trump could have it. Some people who are watching may disagree with me on this. I think Donald Trump is corrupt as they come, and has basically put all of these industry lobbyists in charge of the entire federal government, and basically given big corporations tax cuts and regulatory rollbacks, and given everybody exactly what they wanted. Yet he's the champion of the oligarchy. But let's put that aside. People may disagree with me on that. The phenomenon I'm talking about is that American exceptionalism may be on the wane, because starting in 2015, 2016, a lot of Americans, and the polls bear me out, began saying something is fundamentally wrong with our system. We need to fix it. We need to unrig it. And I think most people feel exactly the same today.
Yeah, I think that's a great assessment, and I'm curious about that as well. I have a question along those lines, but I want to double back to some questions that are appearing on my chat screen here. And so here's one from the audience. How can we convince people that the system is rigged without undermining their faith in government's ability to represent our interests? Do you have any ideas how we might do this? Because that's a tricky one, right? That's a really tricky moment.
It's tricky. But the way we do it is, number one, we have to be honest about what's happened. That is, we can't paper it over. We can't pretend that our government is working. And we can't pretend that our government is working for average working people and the working class and the lower working class and the poor. We can't pretend that. We've got to be honest. That's number one. Number two, we've got to talk about when it did work. Now, I am old enough to remember the 1950s and 1960s, and there were things that were wrong. We were not there. We were not where we should be, but we were making an effort. We had the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Women were given more opportunities than ever before. We were still far from where we should be, but the middle class was growing. It was more people were getting educated. More people were able to go to public universities. The University of California, where I now teach, was charging $0 for tuition and fees. $0. We were not where we should be, but we were moving in the direction of equal opportunity. Anybody remembers, even the late 40s, the GI Bill, which was an extraordinary opportunity for so many people to attend college who could not have attended college. And then Medicare after that. I mean, we were moving in the right direction, but what's happened since the 1980s is we've been moving in exactly the opposite direction. So when I say to people, we could do better, we can do better. I remember a time when we did do better. You have to illustrate that. You have to show people that it is possible, and we have done it in this country.
Yeah, I think that's really great, and in fact, I think the concrete reference to the past is really important in a couple ways. One, I can say that my father went to college on the GI Bill and moved into the middle class. I was a product of lots of public investment, from a very good public education to college to most of my employers in life have been, funded by the generous taxpayers. And I like to think that I repay that every day, and that's sort of how this is supposed to work, right? And so I'm an example of this. I want to say that this brings me to this question of crises and change, right? And that I'm an historian, and so we like to focus and think about moments of crisis where or even trauma that can induce fundamental changes. Political liberals like to reference the New Deal and the Great Society for inspiration, even dripping back more than 100 years ago to progressivism and doing what you're saying, describing, right, how these things have happened, and we have had structural change, or at least we've had an honest appraisal of the situation, which I think is critical to all of this. But there's also a more ominous path. Naomi Klein documented the shock doctrine, where the existing system retrenches and inequalities deepen. I think we saw this, as you mentioned a little while ago, following the 2008 financial crisis, that rather than structural change, right, things actually got worse, right? The conditions grew worse. Some might argue that in the realm of surveillance and civil liberties, that we had a similar or analogous situation after 9/11, right? That we moved in sort of a direction of not only erosion of civil liberties, but also endless war. And so there are these sort of push and pull here. And I was reading in just The Guardian, Peter Baker's "What Comes Next," right, just a little while ago, that really speaks to this. So what's your sense? What's the hinge point? What's the mechanism, right? How do we take control of this moment and move ourselves toward a more just society?
Well, first of all, you, Brian, as a historian, you know exactly what I'm about to say, and you've studied it. But let me just say it for everyone else. National traumas, points of trauma, whether we're talking about war or pandemic or deep depression, they are points at which society reassesses where it is. There's no guarantee that those traumas are going to lead to progressive, positive social change, greater equality. Sometimes they lead in the opposite direction. Now, we know over the last 120 years, for example, that the first Gilded Age, the excesses of the robber barons, the excesses of inequality and corruption did generate, starting with the Roosevelt administration, Teddy Roosevelt, in 1901, a huge progressive reaction. People actually rose up. I mean, there was a palpable change in politics because so many Americans were so outraged about how far we had drifted from our fundamental ideals of equal opportunity and equal political representation. And the following years really did see a flowering of progressive reform. But then what happened? It ended. It ended suddenly with World War I. Why did it end? It ended because the combination of the war and the revolution in Russia created a kind of jingoism, a kind of xenophobia in America that prevented us from moving forward. In fact, it invited us, and demagogues who took advantage of that actually invited us to move backwards. And so we regressed. Instead of being progressive, we went into a regression. And then we had the trauma of the 1929 crash, the great crash, the great stock market crash, but it was an economic crash leading directly to the Great Depression. And What happened then? We could have regressed. I mean, other countries went into fascism. Uh, they really, their societies could not stand the trauma. We, however, were blessed with the right leadership at the time. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, and we reverted not to something negative, but we actually, the better angels of our nature, to use Abraham Lincoln's phrase, we moved forward. We became a more inclusive society. We created Social Security, unemployment insurance. We gave more bargaining rights to labor unions. We created a 40-hour work week and time and a half for overtime. We did all sorts of things to make ourselves a more inclusive and just society, and we made democracy work better. The Second World War could have moved in either direction. It was another national trauma. But as I alluded to before, we felt more united. Out of the Second World War, out of that sense of social solidarity, came not only the GI Bill, but eventually Medicare and Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. We had the right leadership in place. We had the right, we were almost tuned appropriately for that. So Brian, the short answer, in short, the summary answer to your question is, we don't know. A trauma creates opportunities, but also grave risks.
Indeed. Thank you, Robert. I've been thinking a lot about that, right? And thinking about these hinge points and how this works. And I want to move to a couple of other questions that have come to my chat here. And this one reads, during this current crisis, the government has already spent trillions of dollars. What are some of the smart ways that money should be spent to best help working people and small businesses?
Well, I would say, number one, don't bail out the big guys, all right? Don't bail out anymore. I mean, you should never bail out the aircraft. And Boeing, are you kidding? Boeing doesn't need any more money. Boeing is doing just fine. You don't bail them out. And the Fed is actually behind the scenes. People don't know this. The Fed is buying back all that debt all these big corporations have created over the last 10 years. And that debt is been used by these corporations to buy back their shares of stock. And now they're being bailed out by the Fed. No, stop it. Use that money for average people, for working people, for poor people. Use that money to help people survive right now. All right? And that includes small businesses. Don't define small businesses as any business that has fewer than 500 people. Why don't you define small businesses as businesses that have fewer than 50 people? I mean, really, mom and pop, Main Street businesses. And don't give any of that money. Right now, Congress is coming up with another small business, so-called small business. Don't give it to the businesses that have the most lobbyists and don't depend on the big banks like J.P. Morgan Chase to decide who's going to get all of those loans. They give it to their biggest customers. Hello?
Right. Exactly. No, I think that's right. And I've also, thought a lot about, experimenting with a guaranteed basic income and just start writing people some checks and keeping them afloat, right? Just as long as this needs to go. But I hear you. So let me go to another question here. This one reads, it seems that a lot of these economic structural changes can be traced to Reaganomics. How can we move away from the hero worship, particularly in red states, of the myth of trickle-down economics? This sort of follows a number of things we've been talking about already.
Well, first of all, people have got to understand trickle-down economics doesn't work. It's never worked. It didn't work for Reagan. I mean, the reason that there was a Reagan so-called recovery is because he spent so much money. Right. Because he gave tax cuts to the rich and big corporations. That Reagan spending, it was huge spending, unbelievable. The national debt went up, and it went up under George H.W. Bush. The debt is a problem, but it wasn't because of trickle-down economics that things worked out well. It was on the spending side that things worked out better. And when George W. Bush also gave big tax cuts to the biggest corporations and the wealthy, nothing trickled down. Hello, I think people have just got to understand history. Right. Donald Trump and the Republican Congress provided a huge $2 trillion tax cut in December of 2017 to the biggest corporations and the wealthiest people in this country, nothing trickled down. They used it to buy back their shares of stock. And then they went deeper and deeper into debt. And they were already going into debt to buy back their shares of stock. I mean, you just look at the record. Yep. Why is it that the median wage in the United States, the wage of the smack in the middle, has not gone up? It's basically where it was in the late 1970s, adjusted for inflation. Well, it's because nothing has trickled down, folks. Nothing has trickled down. Trickle down economics is the biggest hoax in the world in terms of.
Yeah, you better believe it. I mean, and I think I appreciate you saying that. I want to sort of shift. I've got another question from a audience person, but I've got one that I want to jump in right now that takes us in a little bit of a different direction, but still on the same theme. So I'm interested in the role of foundations and universities and philanthropy in this whole mix of things, because this is all out there too, right? We have philanthropy in some sense advertising itself as the antidote to the declining state. We have foundations that are funding studies and professors. You've got people like me working at universities that are, I think, very honest and in their desire to talk about inclusion and diversity and social justice, but when it comes time to speak about the structure of power in the economy, less so. And so I'm sort of interested in that sort of aspect of the equation here, and maybe motivated a little bit by winners take all on that, that set of conversations.
Well, I'm very much in favor of philanthropy. I think it's wonderful. The people being generous. Generosity is great. Let's celebrate. Right. But let's also keep in mind a couple of things. Number one, it's very tiny. I mean, all the philanthropy in the United States, if you add it all up this year, comes to about 2% of the federal budget. It's just not going to substitute for what government does. Number two, the philanthropy is even small relative to the philanthropists. I mean, Jeff Bezos just gave $100 million to U.S. food banks, and that's good. I'm glad he did that. But that $100 million for Jeff Bezos, who's the CEO of Amazon, amounts to 11 hours of his earnings. He earns $100 million in just 11 hours. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. He ought to be. I think we ought to be thankful that he is contributing $100 million. But it's nothing. It's nothing compared to the 110 or 11 billion dollars that he has that keeps on going up every day. The third thing to bear in mind is that with money comes power, and I think, Brian, that's what you were getting at. And let me give you an illustration. Because at Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley, like every university, state universities are dependent on, to some extent, on philanthropy. And I was asked to be part of a faculty committee to come up with research projects that we would go to philanthropists, major foundations, and ask for funding. And I suggested a research project on the relationship between wealth and power, and how great wealth actually possibly can have a chilling effect on research projects. Well, guess what? The note I got back from the university was, we can't sell this. In fact, there's going to be, this could antagonize some of the philanthropists. So we're not going to include this.
Yeah. I think there's,
points. I mean, the Google Foundation was one of the biggest contributors to something called the New America Foundation, a kind of liberal think tank. But when the New America Foundation started to look at antitrust, anti-monopoly laws, and started to look at Google as a potential monopolist, guess what? Google pulled the funding. Well, I could give a lot of examples.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I also agree with you that I'm grateful for generosity and philanthropy, but sometimes, it has been coupled in some ways with the decline in the actual public sphere. And sometimes we confuse philanthropic projects for the public sector and the
Also,
public sphere.
a lot of the philanthropists have enjoyed huge tax cuts and subsidies and bailouts. And that has starved the public sector and awarded the philanthropists, the wealthy, the big corporations. So yes, their philanthropy is great, but when it comes really because they and their power over legislatures have dictated tax cuts and bailouts, then you can see that by celebrating philanthropy, we're sort of celebrating a rotten system.
Right. Right. I think that's the tangle that I'm thinking about as well. So I've got one other question from the audience before we quit. But before I do, I want to say something, which is buy this book, right? Buy the book. Check out Magic City Books online shop. Get another copy of The System for a friend, a T-shirt, a gift card for Mother's Day. So it's magiccitybooks.square.site, but go to Magic City and buy this book. It's really, really great. So here's a question from the audience. Beside voting in local and federal elections, what's the single most important thing average citizens like us can do to affect positive change?
Obviously, voting is critical and voting is important. It's just not enough. It's important that we regard citizenship as an active practice. And by that, I mean, not only that we do things, Brian, like you do, serve on school boards and get involved in local life, local public life, make sure that our cities and our counties and our states are doing better, even run for election. That sounds radical. It's not, it shouldn't be just the politicians, career politicians. You ought to think about running, but also think about mobilizing your friends and relations and people you know, mobilizing and organizing them so they vote and they put up good people for election and they get involved in school boards and they are educated to know that citizenship requires a lot of us. Teach our children about citizenship. You know, when I was a kid and went to school, there was a course called citizenship education. And I was taught not only how government worked, but I was taught that one of my responsibilities in life was to be an active participant in our democracy. Well, the kids are not taught that anymore. I think they should be, and we should raise them up to see, if they're not watching their parents be active citizens in our democracy, find friends and find other people who can be models for these children of active citizenship. We want them, we need them. And finally, Brian, let me just say, I've been teaching for 40 years. When I haven't been in government, I've been teaching. And I'm happy to say that the present generation of students I am now teaching is more engaged, more involved, more dedicated, more committed to a better America than any generation I've ever taught before. So whenever I'm feeling down, a little despairing about where we are, I rejoice in the fact that I'm handing off the country in a kind of metaphoric way, as you are, to a fabulous young generation for the future.
Well, Robert, I can't think of a better way to close, and let me just concur. I've been teaching for almost 30 years, and I completely agree. This is the most engaged, most inspiring generation of students that I have seen in maybe my entire career, but certainly in a very long time. And they move me and make me feel, as you say, confident that that we're passing this off to a good generation. In fact, I often say it's time for old timers like me to get out of the way, right? And just
You're an old timer. I'm an old timer.
right.
I'm soon. But look at Brian. Let me thank you for asking terrific questions. Let me thank you again for your service, your education, your professorships, and everything you're doing for your students. I want to thank Jeff Martin again and Magic City Books for inviting me virtually, but also inviting me in reality. I'm just sorry I couldn't be there. And I want to thank all of you, not only those of you who bought my book and those of you who will buy my book, but also those of you who bothered to spend time tonight with me and Brian. And thank you for your interest. Thank you for being the citizens you are. Thank you for carrying on the fight. And please, please be safe.
Thank you so much, Robert. I really appreciate it. It's been my honor to meet you virtually. I hopefully meet you in person sometime. But be safe and carry on the fight. And thank you for inspiring us.
Good night.
Good night.
All right. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. That concludes our program. We will have a link for this video that will go out to everybody, or including the folks that weren't able to join us tonight. And so thank you very much. If you need anything, check out the website, magiccitybooks.com, and be well. We will see you all again soon. Good night.
Thanks, Pat. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Robert.